Alright, here's the thing. Beginners are always taught that if they want to be a pro, they need to always shoot in manual mode, but that is not the case. There are other modes on our dials here in our camera for a reason, but there are two in specific that I want to highlight in this video to make your photography journey a whole lot easier. And believe it or not, most pros don't always shoot in manual mode. Now, don't get me wrong, manual mode gives you the most control, and oftentimes it's incredibly helpful when you're shooting an environment where you have constant lighting and nothing's gonna change and you have all the time in the world. But in an environment where the scene is constantly changing, especially the lighting, constantly having to adjust your settings every time and anywhere can get frustrating. Thankfully, there are several modes on your camera that gives you a hybrid auto and manual mode. Manual in a sense where you still get to pick at least one important setting to change, and your camera automatically decides the other two settings for you. So starting off with aperture priority mode, and that's going to be denoted as A or AV on your dial. This is probably the most preferred hybrid auto/manual method by any photographers because 1, this mode has the least amount of numbers to go through and to think about, and 2, it controls the amount of background blur or bokeh that we get in our photos. And this is usually our guiding star to determine what our final image is going to look like. This is arguably the best mode to shoot in when we're photographing still life to slow moving subjects. Now in aperture priority mode, shutter speed and ISO will automatically be determined by the camera to achieve proper exposure, so we don't ever have to think about them. So if we're taking a portrait and we want a super blurry background, we just choose whatever the lowest f-stop number is on our lens, and the camera will choose the shutter speed and ISO to properly expose our shot. But if we feel like our overall exposure seems too bright or too dark, we can use the exposure compensation dial on our camera to adjust the overall exposure. This just tells the camera to change the shutter speed and ISO for us to either brighten or darken the overall image. Now, depending on the model of camera you have, the exposure compensation dial might be obviously labeled and might not be obviously labeled. And if you have a camera that doesn't have a dedicated exposure comp dial, then it's usually a button you can press on your camera to activate it. And aperture priority is usually enough to get by for most people. But let's take it one step further. We don't want the camera to determine the ISO for us as well. Now, I'm severely dumbing this down, but ISO is a setting on our camera that can be thought of as digitally brightening or darkening our overall image. There's so much more to ISO, but we're keeping it simple for this video. Now, as you can imagine, too much of it can be a bad thing, so using too high of an ISO can result in a lot of noise in our dark areas, which is considered undesirable for a lot of photographers. And oftentimes when we shoot in auto ISO, it can set us to just 100, which is great in theory, but depending on the lighting conditions, our camera then might shoot at a much slower shutter speed, which might end up being too slow to get a stable shot, resulting in a blurry photo. Shutter speed, and again, I'm dumbing this down a lot, determines how fast the camera captures the photo, and it's measured by 1 second. So this number right here is a fraction of that 1 second. 1/8,000 is considered super fast, 1/8 is considered slow, and 8 is considered super slow because then it's just literally 8 seconds for your camera to spit you back out an image. And when your camera chooses a slow shutter speed for you, you might end up with a blurry photo. So this is why we want to control the ISO as well. For bright scenes, I would recommend setting the ISO anywhere between 320 to 640. Now the camera only has to take care of the shutter speed for us, and it will likely use a faster shutter speed to not only get us the proper exposure, but also guarantee in getting us a sharp photo. And because we're photographing at such bright scenes, we don't have to worry about getting a noisy image. We will only have to worry about using high ISO during darker scenes because that's when the noise are a lot more apparent. So for darker scenes, depending on what camera we're using, if it's a full frame camera, then I typically wouldn't go past 6400. And if it's an APS-C camera, then I typically wouldn't go past 3200. Of course, the threshold on these numbers can vary depending on how modern your camera is and what your personal noise tolerance level is, but these numbers are gonna be your safe bets. So here's my advice. Get a few clicks in first, review the photos, and then make adjustments to your ISO settings. And last month, I went super in-depth on the fundamentals of aperture, so go ahead and click right up here to queue it up for later. Before we move on to the next hybrid auto manual mode, I want to give a quick shout out to KH Camera for sponsoring a portion of this video. KH Camera is a reputable site to shop pre-owned camera gear from. Everything that comes their way gets thoroughly inspected and all backed by their 180-day warranty should something go wrong, or 21 days to return if you end up not liking it. Perfect time to pick up that lens or camera that you've been eyeing on for 2024. And they also offer additional product protection in partnership with Extend. To learn more, check out my link down below to get 5% off your next purchase or 5% more when you sell. Many thanks for listening. Now back to the video. Next up is shutter priority mode, or denoted as S or TV on your dial. And this is arguably the most preferred mode to shoot in when we're photographing fast-moving subjects like cars, sports, wildlife, etc. So watch as I'm dialing the shutter speed to the left here. As you can see, there's a lot more blur happening as we go down in number to the point where I'm becoming a slow-moving ghost. Vice versa, as we dial to the right, there's less and less blur to the point where you can pause the frame at any second and see that I'm frozen in action. And that's the thing that you need to keep in mind when you want to freeze high action stuff. Here's the general rule of thumb for handheld photography. If you're using a full frame camera, shoot at your focal length. If you're using a 50mm, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/50. If you are using an APS-C sensor camera, double your focal length. So if you're using a 50mm, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/100. Using this general rule of thumb as our baseline, we will increase or decrease the shutter time depending on what we're photographing. And this is going to require a quick trial and error test. If things are moving fairly quickly and you can keep up with it, you can try 1/250 or 1/500. But if things are racing past you and they have a potential of leaving your frame really quickly, then you can try 1/1000, 1/2000, or even 1/4000. Again, same advice, get a few clicks in, review the photos, and make adjustments if necessary. When it comes to shutter priority, I would keep auto ISO on. If anything, I would set my auto ISO to not exceed a certain ISO limit. Again, if it's a full frame camera, then I typically wouldn't go past 6400, and if it's an APS-C camera, then I typically wouldn't go past 3200. Of course, the threshold on these cameras again can vary depending on how modern your camera is and what your noise tolerance level is, but these numbers are going to be your safe bets. For more easy photography tips, check out my playlist right here, and if you enjoy what I do and you want to further support the channel, you can do so via a super thanks. Super thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys in the next video. Peace.